Hi everyone. So today we'll talk about the Poetic Edda by Snorri Sturluson. And I have to apologize in advance for my pronunciation. There is a lot of foreign words in this video, and names too, of course. The various poems within the Poetic Edda were created before the northern countries converted to Christianity. They contain a variety of mythological stories and some pagan beliefs that predate Christianity within the Viking world. Snorri Sturluson relied on the Poetic Edda for information when he composed the Prose Edda, also called the Younger Edda. Comparing this book of epic poetry with world literature for importance and how much mythology within its own tradition that it contains. The Poetic Edda is comparable with the Finnish Kalevala, Ovid's Metamorphoses, or India's Mahabharata. The Poetic Edda influenced many writers throughout time, including Thomas Gray, William Morris, W.H. Auden in Britain, Richard Wagner, August Strindberg, and Carl Larsson in Europe, and the great Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges. Fantasy writers such as J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Alan Gardner have incorporated its themes and motifs into the worlds about which they write. The Wolves of Winter of Lewis's Narnia, Tolkien's Dwarves and Dragons, and even the Weird Stone of Brisangimen owe their genesis to the poems in this collection. That's a quote from the introduction in my edition that you can see on your screen. A bit technical here, but maybe of interest to those curious about exactly which poems are contained in this edition. English editions of the Prose Edda may contain different poems because the translator or editor may wish to include some from various old manuscripts. The majority of the poems will be from the main manuscript called the Codex Regius. This Oxford World's Classics edition contains 6 poems from the AM 7484-2 manuscript. This manuscript contains some key basics that make up the Poetic Edda and is the only source for one of the poems, called Baldur's Dreams, or in terrible Norwegian, Baldur's Dramar. The others are also preserved in the Codex Regius. The Waking of Agnantir is contained in this edition. Other mythological poems that are contained from various manuscripts are List of Rig, Song of Hyndla, Song of Grotti. 2 that can be considered Neo-Eddic are included are Groa's Chant and the Sayings of Flodvin. These 2 are probably from the 4th century. They imitate the style of earlier Eddic poems and were composed well after the introduction of Christian doctrine and Latin learning to Iceland. The Waking of Angantyr is an Eddic poem preserved in the saga of Hervor, and Hedrick has fascinated poets and audiences from the 18th century onwards. Also, a second version of the very famous Sirius's prophecy is included as an appendix in the back. The majority of the Eddic poems have been recorded in the 13th century. Most of the mythological ones predate Christian Scandinavia in the 10th century. No satisfactory method has yet been found to date the poems relative to one another. Not has it been proved possible to localize them to Norway or Iceland. The earliest ones are thought to be the Lay of Hamir and the poem of Atli. The author of the Poetic Edda is Snorri Sturluson. He was an Icelandic author and historian who lived between 1179 to 1241. He wrote a treatise on Norse poetry, which he called an Edda. The etymology of the word Edda is uncertain, but for 4th century Icelandic, that language, it means poetics. Codex Regius was written around the 1270s and then went missing from Iceland until 1643 when Bishop Brynjolf Sveinsson gave it to the Danish king. This is when it was named the Codex Regius. This king thought it shared a history with Snorri, and that Sæmund the Wise collected the wisdom that it contains. The famous Icelandic scholar named Sæmund the Wise lived in 1056 to 1133, and he studied in Paris. Because of his reputation for being such a great learner, the Codex Regius was named after him. At the time, it was called the Sæmundar Edda, or the Elder Edda, while Snorri's poetic treatise, written before the Codex Regius was compiled, is known as Snorra Edda, or the Prose Edda, or the Younger Edda. The Codex Regius was finally returned to Iceland by boat in a great ceremonial shipping during the 1970s, and has been called the Codex Regius ever since. The Poetic Edda contains mythical poetry on a variety of topics. Sometimes the stories contradict each other because they are drawing from many different sources. It's a great place for those who are serious about exploring Norse mythology to really get started learning about it. You'll learn various creation stories, beginning with the birth of the cosmos, creation of the gods, the world, humankind, and everything in between. Because it's so dense with mythological information, there are plenty of rabbit holes to explore when looking up the who's who of various stories. Some old familiars, such as Thor and Odin, are contained in here. There are poems which contain long-running jokes, and others that outline social etiquette. There are sections for history and prophecy, wars, and magic. I would recommend reading the Prose Edda after the Poetic Edda because it will help to clarify some of the more condensed sections. The Prose Edda expands on what Snorri begins in the Poetic Edda. Neil Gaiman's Norse Mythology is also helpful for absolute beginners who are entirely new to Norse mythology. Thank you very much for listening, and I will, in the description box, put in a list of all the names that I attempted to pronounce in the order that I attempted to pronounce them. So if they're not even recognizable in Norwegian, at least you have the English spelling, I hope. So that's all. Thanks again very much for listening, and have a good day. Bye, everyone.